Many Greens and academics think that closing down the Australian fishing or hardwood forest industry is good for the environment. And in some instances, that can be true. But in many instances, all that often happens is that we export the environmental impacts to other countries, countries that are far less able to deal with the environmental damage or environmental consequences than ours, countries which have far worse environmental protection. Just the other day, I needed some hardwood for a job on the house. I went to the local timber merchant, specifically asked for Aussie hardwood, which used to be so common, not available anymore. All I could get was something that came out of Southeast Asia. God knows which country's rainforest was cleared to grow it, and it is nowhere near as good as the Australian hardwood. Same day, I went to get some fish and chips, and of course the fish was from Thailand. The local mackerel supplies, which were once very common up here in North Queensland, have dried up as the fishing licences have been taken away by the government. And I should add that there's very little evidence of any decline in the fish population in the last, say, 30 years. The rules and regulations for fish farms along the coast are utterly diabolical, so there is no thriving fish farming along this coast. Australia now imports 60 to 70% of its fish, despite having an area of sea which is one of the biggest in the world and one of the longest coastlines of any country. Contrast that with, say, Thailand. They've got a small coastline, small area of sea. Do you think the environmental regulations for their fish farms and their offshore fishing industry is within a bull's roar of the effectiveness of the Australian regulations? So all we've really done here is not a positive thing for the environment. All we've done is just exported damage to Thailand. But returning to forestry, we've banned native forest hardwood industry in Victoria and Western Australia and greatly restricted it in all the other states. Now, as with fishing, some of the past practices, and I'm talking going back decades, were frankly a bit rape and pillage of the forest. But those days are long gone. It's like blaming the Labor Party for supporting the White Australia back in the day, which they did. Things have changed. Modern forestry, which takes now a very long-term view, is actually now better for the forest than much of the management or lack of management that occurs in some of our national parks. There's much better fire management in forestry areas, but that's another story. In the case of Australia, Australia actually has a lot of forest. Every small town had a sawmill back in the day. By closing down the forestry industry, in some regions for good reason, but in other regions actually not, we just exported the problem. Those Southeast Asian rainforests, well, the destruction of those is one of the biggest environmental disasters on the planet, perhaps the biggest. But nobody seems to care, and in fact Australia is making that problem worse by our own policies. And this problem can extend in perverse ways to other industries. So, for example, we export a lot of beef. We used to export a lot of sheep from Western Australia, but the government banned that. But if we reduce our exports which were done under very strict environmental controls and the highest animal welfare rules, well, if we stop, then what happens? Some other country will step into production, almost always with far worse environmental regulations. And will they care about the animal welfare like we do? And it's the same with coal. Even if you are worried about climate change, if Australia does not export coal to, say, India, they will use coal from somewhere else. They're going to, all right? And Aussie coal is amongst the cleanest in the world because it contains very low levels of sulfur, amongst other things, and that can cause diabolical air pollution. And Aussie coal making Indian electricity is a far cleaner way, for example, for cooking than collecting sticks or burning cow dung, which occurs in many parts of the world. That's a terrible way. The bottom line is that the environmental regulations which started to be introduced in Australia and elsewhere in the 1960s have done huge good things in Australia. We've stopped those very bad practices in agriculture, cleaned up the air in cities. Modern cars are literally thousands of times cleaner than the old cars by some pollution measures. It turns out we kind of won the environmental war back in the 1990s. And then it all went a bit strange. We started to overdo things a bit, quite a lot. We closed down and restricted industries which were already reformed. And this has actually meant that we were exporting the environmental destruction. Closing many forests and fishing areas has actually meant the world went backwards. You've got to take the bigger picture. So that's why the AEF focuses on cost-benefit analysis of environmental issues, and that almost always means you've got to look at the economic cost-benefit balance too. Now, until, 50 years ago, there was a very accurate description of many Australians, especially out here in the bush, which was, if it moves, shoot it, if it grows, chop it down. Now, those attitudes were just a reflection of the hardships faced by, pioneering Australians over centuries. But we seem to have replaced that attitude with an attitude that all our prime ministers are universally evil and must be strangled. So not only is that damaging the economy, but it actually damages the environment in other parts of the world. So that's why this Check the Science campaign by the Australian Environment Foundation is very important, because we actually want to look at the bigger picture of what's actually going on here. So check the science, go to the AEF webpage. Thanks very much.